Welcome to the Broadside Podcast.
With host, my dad, Andy Elliott.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Broadside Podcast. I'm Andy Elliott, and today we're going to dive into the wild world of conservation policy. I'm joined once again by Kelsey Ross, and we sit down and chat with Margen Carlson, the Conservation Director of the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And Margen gets to share some incredible insight and look into her role in shaping conservation policies, the tricky balance between human population growth and preserving our natural habitats, along with, building trust in landowners and trying to find that balance between all stakeholders. We chat a little bit about some big money funding plans for biodiversity and the state wildlife action plan. But before we dive into that, I want to just say thanks for everybody who pays attention and listens. If you support what we're doing, head on over to elliotoutdoors.com, pick up a shirt, hat, guns, ammo, whatever you might need to gear up for your next adventure in the outdoors. I'm going to be putting together some YouTube videos. Head on over and watch some of those. You can watch these podcasts live not live, but the video part on YouTube. And I just want to say thanks to everyone who's paying attention. Thanks for the outreach, the comments, the input. Keep it coming, and you guys keep this thing rolling. So thank you. And so if you wouldn't mind just giving us a brief introduction and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, totally, Andy. Thanks for having me on. Also, I'm Margen Carlson. I'm the Conservation Director for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've been doing this role for just a little bit of time. I started this role in November, but I've worked for the agency for about 21 years in different capacities. So it's fun to step into this new chair and see the work and partners like you guys kind of from a different vantage point.
Well, thank you for coming on. We're so happy to have you. You and I have connected in the past, and I just really have enjoyed our conversations.
Me too.
Yeah, you've just come from this place of wanting to bring people together and do what is right for habitat, for wildlife. And I just appreciate that approach very, very much. But I want to know a little bit more about what your job is as a conservation policy director. I don't think most people know what that is. They hear the conservation policy and they get a little spicy. And that is not what you are. Yeah.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that. And I'll come at it from the perspective of, when my mom asks me, like, what is it that you're doing now? And it is a little bit in flux, I guess, too, because it's a relatively new role, kind of the origin story for this conservation director role. When Director Suzwind became the director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, he wanted there to be a position in the director's office that was really focused on the agency's conservation work and just kind of bringing that like director's office level presence and vision and attention to that work. There's so much we were already doing. So when I stepped into this role, not that long ago, 7 months ago or so, part of what Kelly and I talked about is our shared interest around continuing that attention to the agency conservation work, what we are already doing, as well as increasing the types of people and entities involved in our work. I really have a passion for making sure that we're continuing the relationships and the partnership with folks like you, sportsmen and women, with our tribal partners, with the public and NGOs, people who are already engaged in our work. But it's also kind of cool when you look out there and you look at, the numbers of young people trying to also think about urban and suburbanizing areas. What are they doing to help think about, temperature and access to nature and what being a steward of nature looks like in those areas too. And so I think there's a lot of potential for partnership in ways that the department hasn't fully tapped into yet. And that's really interesting to me as well. Maybe more specifically though, I think the way I describe the role, my mom asks me that question, I say, well, this role is, I'm Kelly's advisor. I'm the director's advisor on our conservation work. A big part of that role is looking at the big picture and setting a vision for our the long term of our conservation work. But then equally importantly, working with people inside the department, outside the department to really rally folks to that vision. And hopefully by doing that, have increased the pace and scale of our conservation work. And when I say our, I mean all of our conservation work. On a really practical level, I think a lot of what I end up doing is being like a change agent. We're not trying to build out big programs and operations in the director's office. More of what I do is when I or someone else on the big team here sees either a risk to our conservation work or an opportunity to really make it better. Part of what I do is jump in and bring some of my skills around pulling people together, around collaboration, around problem solving or making relationships better to kind of set those things on a track. If it's a risk, sometimes it's like problem solving, right? Trying to get something on a better track. And sometimes it's an opportunity thing. Like, I've gotten involved in some conversations at the federal level with Congress where they're contemplating getting a lot more funding to states for the kind of work we do together. And I help advocate for that or make the case, about why that's really needed and what kind of results we'll see. So those are some of the practical things. I'm responsible for the agency strategic plan too. And so that's an outgrowth of that kind of big picture, long-term work. But I think ultimately there's the strategic visioning and planning part, but then, and I might have said this to you, Kelsey, when we talked before, but a lot of the work ends up being people work. Like how do I help people work together to actually do the stuff that we say we want to do?
Yeah, you really have this huge role, a really important role, and are doing a lot. You wear a lot of hats, it seems, and it's pretty impressive how you really take the time to talk to people like me and, hunters and people from all different groups and take that and build something that is better for conservation overall in the state. It's impressive, everything you're doing. I want to get back to kind of your origin story. You've been, like you said, you've been with the department for over 20 years. I would like to know more about how you got into work with wildlife conservation, habitat conservation, what inspired you to take that path, and just kind of the different hats that you've worn through in the department for however many years you've been in it.
Yeah, that's one of those questions. It's like, be careful when you ask someone who's passionate about it, and then you're like, oh my gosh, 2 hours later, I'll try to rein it in. My interest in this kind of work is probably not that different, honestly, than the two you guys or a lot of the folks listening. Like I was one of those feral kids outside all the time. My parents were really into the outdoors, boating, a little bit of crabbing, hiking in the woods. So I was one of those kids who was like wading in the stream, catching the tadpoles, or my parents were teachers, so not a lot of money, but we had a lot of time in those summers, and we basically spent it all outdoors, looking for crabs under rocks and counting the sea stars and all that kind of stuff. That was me. And I just never really outgrew it, honestly. And when I went to college, I studied a ton of biology. Just in high school, I was always taking those classes. And when I went to college, I studied zoology, but really what I did was, was a lot of biology and ecology and doing field work. And then I thought a little bit about going on in school, but I realized I was more interested in how people use the science that comes from biology to like make decisions and protect those resources. And later on, I was doing some informational interviews with folks here at the department connected to salmon recovery and people who were involved in salmon recovery, and got a call a couple weeks later from the person at the time who was managing the lead entity program, which is basically like, you might know about it, but one of the essentially nonprofits that really do a lot of community engagement in salmon recovery. And I got a call and they were like, hey, we could probably fund an internship. You want to come here for an internship? And here we are 22 years later. I would say my work here at the department kind of fits into three sort of buckets. Early on, I came in as like a policy analyst. So I was just working on specific topics like learning about land use or mitigation for highway projects, or I helped author the agency's first Lands 2020 process, which was like trying to capture how we go about deciding about acquiring lands or trying to help a partner do it. So early sort of like junior analyst type jobs. And then I started being interested in supervising people. I think if you would have asked me 20 years ago, I would have been like, no, don't want to ever supervise people. And I started to see how the kinds of big ideas that you can have when you're an analyst, that's super cool. But then if you're not working with the people who work in the organization to figure out how to actually get that work done on a practical level, you don't really get a lot of the results. So I took on increasing management responsibilities, supervising people and guiding programs. And then for the last 10 years or so, before I took this job working directly for Kelly, I was either the Habitat Program Deputy or the Habitat Program Director. And I learned a ton about how to take great ideas and actually work with an organization of people to get it done. So that's kind of all the stuff that I'm bringing into this role now, looking at that real big picture and long term of how we do this work.
Yeah, that seemed like that was a really good segue, your prior position to what you're doing now, just taking these ideas and concepts and putting them into action. I like that. I like that you can fill that role now and continue doing that. So I would like to hear more about your habitat policy position that you had before. What that is and how that, how that brought you to where you are. I just said that, but I would like to hear more about it.
Yeah, totally. It's pretty cool. Washington's Department of Fish and Wildlife is pretty unique among a lot of the state fish and wildlife agencies by having a standalone unit just looking at habitat. So folks listening probably really already know a lot, but we've got a fish program, a wildlife program, an enforcement program, and then we've got this standalone habitat program. And I would say first of all, I'll preface this by saying, I feel like describing anything the department does is really tough because we're such a big agency and we do so much good work. It's really hard to boil stuff down. But I think the way I would boil down the habitat program is that, all the ways that people live and work and, develop the human built environment on the landscape. Habitat program has folks who work to try to influence those decisions and try to help what happens out there on the landscape be better for fish and wildlife. So for example, we've got groups of people who know a lot about forestry, and they work together with the Department of Natural Resources and with forest landowners around timber harvest, trying to figure out where do we have leave trees, can we protect riparian areas, that kind of stuff. We've got folks that work on, land use, like how cities and counties are going to develop and set the trajectory and the rules for how we develop, I guess, in Washington. We've got folks working on fish passage, oil spills, again, basically all the ways that the kinds of things people do could present a risk to fish and wildlife. We try to get in there and really provide technical assistance and work collaboratively with those folks to make it better for fish and wildlife. So it's a little bit of that balancing act, right, between the human uses and needs and the fish and wildlife needs. So it's hard work, because I think all the folks who work in that program are often talking with people about, trade-offs, or I know you really want to do this thing. Well, maybe what if you did it this way, and that would leave this corridor, for wildlife on your property. And I think all the folks that work in habitat program have to do a really good job knowing the biology of the critters, knowing how they use the habitats, and what the best practices are for like meeting the fish and wildlife needs. But then they really have to have great people skills to be able to like work with people to influence those decisions, because we're really, for the most part, not deciders. We're just trying to like engage in those kind of discussions and decisions and influence them. So it can be hard work.
So I
This,
think,
sorry, I'm jumping in.
go.
Yeah, like I said before, I don't really have, I'll just be the useful idiot, but I do have a question. It's more of a statement, I guess. But you said, is it rare that states have like a habitat section of their fish and wildlife department?
Yeah, it's pretty rare. Like most of the, and I haven't like done a census or whatever, but just as I talk to folks when there are meetings among all the states, folks I know, most of those fish and wildlife agencies have a fish or fisheries program and a wildlife or a game program. And each of those programs, work they do on habitat is just like underneath those departments. And so for Washington to have this standalone kind of third natural resource program is a little bit unique organizationally. And I mean, on the one side, it's an advantage, right? Because we're putting energy into that, and it's like a capacity builder for that work. But like any other big organization, then we have to make sure we're doing a good job sharing information and science and incorporating with other parts of the agency now.
Yeah, sorry to derail there, but it just kind of seemed weird that they all wouldn't have kind of that same department. But
yeah, no worries. I mean, it does resonate, right? Like, you guys are out in the woods all the time. That where the fish and wildlife live is the habitat, and like if that's not working well, we're all gonna be sad about the results.
yeah, it's kind of like putting your furniture in your house without building the walls, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. I might have to develop that one more.
I have some crying children upstairs, so hopefully you can't hear them. But I wanted to, this habitat piece is so important. We live here in this state that is one of the highest densities of people, smallest land masses, I guess, on the west side of the nation. So yeah, it's really important. And I think I know the answer to the question I'm going to ask you next, but what do you think some of the most significant challenges we are facing for conservation here in this state? And how is the department addressing those?
Yeah, such a great question. And I'm sure you do know the answer. It's not going to be a surprise. I mean, you started to lay the groundwork, right? Like we have a lot of wonderful habitat still in the state. So we're lucky, right? And I think that's part of why people want to live here and keep living here. So some of the things I think about are the fact that Washington's human population growth, we've exceeded the Office of Financial Management's projections for human population growth for, at least the last 10 years or so. So we're not only already dense in many places, but we're really rapidly growing. And I think that if we aren't getting engaged collectively, those of us who are connected to nature and have some additional insight about that are not getting engaged to reshape how we develop. In other words, if we just develop maybe the way that we have over the last amount of time here, I think it will be tough, because I think we'll start facing more trade-offs for the habitat that those fish and wildlife need to fit all those new people in. I do think there's a lot of opportunity there, though. So this gets a little bit to the how we address it part of things. I think there's other places in the world and some bright spots, even in Washington, where we've shown how we can grow and develop. We can provide affordable housing for people, but we can also preserve and maybe restore some connected green space and mitigate some of those effects of growth so that it's not the same amount of trade-offs for fish and wildlife. I think the other thing is there are even places in some of the more developed parts of Washington where I think we have opportunities and choices about restoring those places, or as redevelopment happens in urban spaces or suburban areas, we can change what that actually looks like. Because I think ultimately a lot of this comes down to physically what we're doing with the space around us. The other thing I think, when, going back to your like, okay, well, what do I worry about? So I think that's a big thing. I think another pressure maybe added on top of the human population growth is, changing weather, sea level rise. We know some of the conditions in the world around us are changing. And, again, if we're not tracking that or thinking how to make these ecosystems as resilient to that kind of change as can be, I think there's consequences there that make things worse. Again, like, not to be a total downer, I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think there was hope, though, still about what to do about it. And we brought a lot of really amazing examples, and a lot of those I think are where it comes back to those like relationships and collaboration that we were talking about. So, for example, we've seen some great results with reintroducing Fisher in Washington. And that came from a collaboration with forest landowners who still want to maintain those places as working lands. And we were able to reach agreements about how to protect them continuing to do their work, maybe with a few little accommodations to things that were good for Fisher. And then the Fisher get to be there. And I think those kinds of solutions are the kinds of things that we want to grow. One of the things that ways WDFW really gets engaged in that work is by having staff actually embedded around the state and communities, so you can have those really like place-based conversations. That isn't the model for all Washington's state agencies. I think for federal agencies and some other organizations, they kind of co-locate folks and they end up having to do quite a bit of reviewing things from their desks. They can usually cover a lot more, work in that way. But I think one of the strengths of WDFW is that we have those people embedded in communities, able to have those conversations with, the landowner who has that forest land, or, the community of folks who live right on a shoreline, and they can work with that community to open their willingness to, take their bulkheads out and restore their beaches. And so I think that it's really important to be able to have that like place-based on the ground knowledge of what's going on. So I don't know. I was gonna ramble into other things. I'm restraining myself.
Another curveball for you. So are you involved at all with the I'm gonna butcher this. It's the land owner hunt permit program, right?
I am not involved, and it's something I'm learning more about. But the reason I'm learning about it is, or the reason I want to learn more, is because I think that's another great example, right? Like, you probably brought it up because it's a place where we've got WDFW staff really getting to know landowners. And while I'm not familiar with the oh gosh, this is going to be embarrassing for my wonderful colleagues who ever listen to this, and can't believe I can't remember the name, but it's like the Feel Free to Hunt program, where we work with landowners to increase their willingness to have folks be able to have access. And one of the things that we have definitely found is that those relationships with the landowners can like lead to them introducing other ideas, like, hey, because there's trust there, hey, have you ever thought about maybe you got an opportunity to replant a little bit of that forest on the edge of your field, whatever it is, right? I'm just giving an example, but so much of people's willingness to like do something different than what they're already doing comes down to trust, I think. I mean, you guys have probably experienced that even in your own lives.
Yeah, I was asked. That's kind of why I asked too. I just entered the Master Hunter program this year.
Oh, nice.
I've kind of been chatting with some people to look into that landowner permit program, and because I'm trying to learn a little bit more about it too. So I'll probably bend your ear to see who I need to talk to about it.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we'll learn more
as
together.
well. Yeah, I need to as well. Well, here where I live, we have the department was trying to get landowners engaged because we don't have very much public land, but there's a lot of deer and they have been pretty deleterious to the region. So yeah, I'd love to talk your ear off a little bit about that, or have you send me to the right people.
I am happy to. Yeah, one of the cool programs that we have is our wildlife program landowner services division, run by Fenner Yarborough, and all the folks in that team do amazing work, and a lot of it is what you're talking about, like really connecting with landowners for access, or when we're seeing damage on properties and managing the opportunities that are around addressing damage. So yeah, I'd be happy to do more of that.
It's just to kind of stay on this topic for just a second before we break off into other things. I think it's great how much you guys are working with landowners, or at least you were in the habitat division, because we see here when there's that trust, you have people more willing to work with the department, and not just things like habitat, but also with other animals like predator species and whatnot, and collecting that data for hunting and whatnot.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And I was speaking about the habitat program, and certainly that's a big focus of their work, but that happens throughout the agency. I mean, our fish program folks who are going out and doing spawner surveys, like, think about it, right? They're having to physically knock on doors and be with landowners, or the regional wildlife biologists who are trying to collect data, about the key species for their district. They're having to knock on doors, right? And we're a huge agency, and all of that contributes to the landowner's experience and awareness of what we're doing, and willingness to build that trust and tap into other programs.
So sorry, I was muted.
No problem.
I wanted to we've touched on this a little bit, but you've done a lot of work bringing these diverse stakeholders together to tackle these bigger threats to conservation. That's a lot of your work, it seems like, from our conversation. Habitat loss, fragmentation. So how do you balance those differing perspectives and needs of the different stakeholders, because they are quite diverse here in the state?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the one thing I'll say right off the bat is I think rightfully so, we're all, like, part of what I see our job being and what we're trying to do at the department is seek those diverse perspectives. And if we're doing a good job, right, we're really tapping into as much of the whole public's thoughts and needs and potential effects that they would experience, which is really important. And I mean, it from going to like a family gathering, diverse perspectives are also hard. Like, it's just hard to navigate that. And I think the way I approach that is starting, maybe some of it is just my personal style and values, but a lot of what I start from is just listening. And whether I'm trying to do that more on like a one-on-one or small group level, or when I have responsibility for putting together more like a process around a thing, like a rulemaking, I try to think about how to set it up in a way that, diverse people have access to that process. And I think ultimately that the people who participate not only feel heard, like, and that their opinion and their perspective is like valid and respected. But I think on the back end for our agency consideration, that often what I end up doing is coaching and fostering that we're really taking that in and really trying to deeply like consider it, even if it's maybe different than the thoughts that agency staff have coming in. That is, I think, the hard work of government, right? I feel like that's not a very specific answer to your question, but I would say that maybe reflecting a little bit of some past conversation we've had, Kelsey, I think there's a lot of that diversity is growing in Washington, especially around fish and wildlife. We've got some data from this survey that's been done a few different times over the years called the America's Wildlife Values Survey. And it's really trying to ask, it's a lot of questions, but it's basically trying to get a sense of like, how do people feel about their fish and wildlife? Like, what are their expectations for how they want to see fish and wildlife managed, or what they even think, what are their values around what fish and wildlife are for? And so one thing that's interesting is you can see actually nationwide, although Washington is maybe farther along in like the growing diversity of opinion, but one of the things that we can see in the data nationwide is that historically, I'm talking like way back, right, hundreds of years, the overall more common cultural value was that fish and wildlife are there for people to use. And that's a really important value. We know that more and more people over time are also seeing fish and wildlife as something to sort of be, to care for, or to have a responsibility for, and, or I'm not using the right words to be like, protect fish and wildlife, I guess. And then there's a lot of people in the middle who are called pluralists, and they're both things. Like, yes, I want to use fish and wildlife, and I feel a responsibility to protect and care for them. And I think I said something at the beginning or earlier in our conversation, right, about my value for getting more different types of folks involved and trying to work for conservation and protecting and restoring fish and wildlife. But it also means like we were saying, there's like more different people with different attitudes about fish and wildlife trying to participate in conversations. And I'm not sure this is like a silver bullet to your question, but I feel like in my role here, I have a responsibility for bringing in, as part of good government, starting with a place of respect for all those different perspectives, trying to see where there's maybe common ground, or even if we're motivated by different reasons, is there like a common action that we could rally around, and hopefully find ways of being like a lead or a facilitator in those conversations that help people feel respected. A couple Fish and Wildlife Commission meetings ago, one of the commissioners asked me a similar question, and I'm worried my answer is like dissatisfying in both cases, because I think ultimately what I'm talking about is like my approach to respecting people and trying to build relationships and have respectful conversations. So it's not really like a technical answer, right? Of like, well, first I do this, and then I do this, and then I do that. Am I getting anywhere close to what you were wondering about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have a great approach. I think it's great to listen to people and always have respect from where they're coming from, because we all have our values because of how we've experienced the world.
Right.
And maybe not all, opinions are created equal, but I think it's important to hear them. I also, it's just a hard thing. You're in a really hard place. You're dealing with so many conflicting beliefs. I mean, we're seeing this so much in the climate of what's going on with, wildlife management here in the state. It's just a lot of clashing, but it seems like you've done a really good job of finding that common ground of, we have these issues that we can all agree on. And, we need to focus on these things as well while you're hearing those things, those commonalities. I don't know, I'm impressed. It's hard, and I don't envy the position you have, because it can be polarizing at times.
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks for saying that. And I don't do it perfectly either. And I think it's not always, all rainbows and unicorns either. I think the other piece of the work that I do that I didn't really speak about already is also naming hard things. So, you definitely have to start with listening and trying to find the common ground. And then sometimes part of my job is maybe a little bit unpopular because I have to talk about what isn't working. And like, I hear you saying this, then I hear this person saying this, and it seems like there's some trade-offs there. If we do this thing, here's what some of the consequences might be. And if we do this thing, here's what some of the consequences might be. And I think in my experience, like that's another one of those like hardest things for us all, myself included, to do, is like to have to really look right in the face at what some of the consequences are of the choices we make. And, I don't really, I don't know, there's no perfect solutions that don't result in trade-offs. And I think we live in like we were talking about before, we live in a state that has a lot of development. We have a lot of people here. We've got a lot of important industry and communities, and that's a really good thing. Those benefits to people of that. And so we're going to sometimes still make choices that aren't the best things for fish and wildlife. I'm thinking mostly about, sort of like the development, right, or restoration. But I think at least if we're all weighing the consequences of those things transparently, we can at least be making sort of like eyes wide open choices about that kind of stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a tough spot, and I don't know, I just appreciate how much thought goes into it and just trying to do what's right at the end of the day. I'm
Oh, I think the kids are being like, that's fine.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, you can get them on there. I'm surprised you haven't heard mine. I don't know where to go with that one. Well, go ahead, Kelsey.
I was going to ask, so I want to hear more about some of the projects that you've got going on, if you're able to talk about them. I think that's like some good meat and potato stuff that a lot of people are pretty curious about, like the workings and seeing, we're talking about that stuff, behind the scenes stuff, but putting it in action.
Totally. Yeah, I'm happy to. And I'll also preface this by saying, I alluded to it earlier, there is so much conservation work happening throughout the agency. Like I'll try to note some stuff and just know that like there's nothing like I'm doing by myself. So these aren't I have varying degrees of involvement in things, but maybe the first thing that I would highlight that's a little closer to I have some pretty direct responsibility for helping to lead some of these conversations. I was talking earlier, right, about how important our agency model is of having biologists and hatcheries and facilities and staff all throughout the state that can be part of those community conversations. One of the things that we have seen over time is that a lot of the work we do on species that aren't hunted or fished have been a little underfunded in the past, and some of that habitat work. So we had a pretty cool thing in 2023. We put together a really big budget ask for the state that was based around the idea of protecting and restoring Washington's biodiversity, particularly some of those underloved species and habitats or at-risk things, and trying to increase WDFW's ability to have data and status and trends and understand the status of the different species and what are the recovery actions that are needed, and then actually do that species and habitat protection and recovery work. It was a big package. It was $47 million, and really grateful the state decided to fund a big chunk of that. Ongoing, our 2-year or biennial funding is $30 million, which is just such a huge pump in the arm to biodiversity. But we're coming back again in this next big legislative session, partly in some discussion with some legislators and staff, to ask for that remaining amount of funding, that remaining part of the $47 million, so that we're really implementing like the whole set of strategies, or making sure that we have those right staff to gather data or engage in communities in all the places, not just the geographies we prioritized with that increment. So writing that budget package, working with people all over the place to see if that's something they can advocate for, ultimately working with the legislature is something that I'm doing work on. We're also updating our state wildlife action plan. I don't know, is that something you guys have heard about before?
I have not.
So it's a pretty cool thing, like oh, sorry, Kelsey, did I talk over you there? No? Okay. Nationwide, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, starting in the early 2000s, they had some new sources of funding, state wildlife grants that they wanted to give out to each of the states. And one of the things they asked for in return is like, hey, show us your plan though, right? Like show us what you want to do with this money, really to support the non-hunted and fish species in particular. And we call those plans in each state the State Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP for short. We're government, so I got to throw an acronym in there a little bit. But so you have to every state has to periodically update those. And we're updating ours. It's due October 1st, 2025. And we're really trying to continue the shift from making sure we're talking about the species, but also making sure we're really highlighting actions that can be taken on habitats or across landscapes to have the broadest benefit to those species of greatest conservation need as possible. So we're going to be doing a ton of work over the next, 16 months or so, updating that plan. And there's going to be a lot of opportunity, I think, for public involvement in that. That plan will also highlight a lot of the ongoing conservation work that's happening. So one thing, and Kelsey, you had asked about it earlier, we were talking about development, right? So what do we do when we develop? We put roads in, we're creating that affordable housing where people live. But one of the things we know about fish and wildlife, and you guys probably know, tracking animals in the woods, whether or not their habitat is connected, like big contiguous connected areas of habitat, really makes a difference for most species. And so we got a little bit of money from the legislature to work with a bunch of tribal partners and nonprofit folks who work specifically on that idea of connectivity or providing corridors for animals to move through, as well as with the State Department of Transportation, because we know that the road infrastructure is a huge barrier, like literally, right? How many of us have seen, during rut or like even amphibians or, migrating, you see them on the road. So, it's having an effect. It's also a big deal for safety of motorists. And so we're revamping Washington's connectivity action plan, both relative to the state highway system. So that'll likely lead to more overpasses and underpasses, which is like this win-win, right, for public safety, but also for fish and wildlife, as well as making sure we're trying to identify those places on the landscape. Like, man, if we can we already know animals are using this corridor. If we can just find ways of protecting that and moving development and infrastructure around it, we'll really be preserving those animals' ability to move to where they need to move. And it's a lot of different scales too. I mentioned amphibians, might be salamanders moving across the road, or it might be mule deer winter summer range, or it might be some of the species that have broader migration. So I think especially that's one of those trade-offs that we really are trying to be specific about the actions needed to do best we can preserving those corridors. Another thing I had two other things, if you guys have the time to call out. Another really cool piece of work that the agency is invested in is pollinators. So this is one of those things, like you hear about it a lot in the popular culture, popular media, but it's not a place historically as an agency we had really been super involved in. And yet we know on the terrestrial side of things, like how important those pollinators are to like having the plants there, much less crops and all the human benefits. when you look at the wildlife side, they're kind of like that base of the food web, and so we're trying to increase both what we know, our ability to make recommendations about how people can assist with pollinators. And one of the things that I really love about that is I think sometimes when you hear about these fish and wildlife issues or issues of habitat, I think it can feel really overwhelming, right? Like to think about it at that big scale and um, just feel like, well, what can I do to make a difference there? And pollinators is one of those things like, oh my gosh, every single one of us, whether you've got a balcony on your apartment or shared community space or, a little green space along a roadway, or you have the privilege of having more land that you own or manage, like there is so much that each of us can think about doing for pollinator species. And, a lot of it just comes down to like planting more diverse native plants. It's pretty simple. And so I'm pretty excited about the folks here that are working on that, both getting to know what pollinators need and then trying to translate it like through our Habitat at Home program into just some like really actionable, simple stuff that we can do on small scales, but it makes a difference, like adds up when people do it at cumulative. That's the word I'm looking for. The cumulative effect of a bunch of people do it is a big deal. And then the other thing I was going to call out, just maybe as an example, we have a really wonderful group of folks that works on the science and the policy of understanding how toxic substances get into the food web. And really understanding, like, we're learning so much more about both how some of these, you've maybe heard the term like forever chemicals, like how some of these forever chemicals get into not just our bodies, but to the bodies of fish and wildlife, which means they have a presence and they build up in the food web. But also some of the emerging toxins of concern that we, of course, didn't know before they were a big deal. And now we're learning that they have unintended consequences, like tire dust is a great example. And so we're really investing in that team, building their capacity to know what's going on and kind of understand on the science side, but then also build that extended team's capacity to get engaged in some of the decision making that we're not the lead agency in, but some of the decision making that influences, like, well, what can or can't you do around some of those chemicals, or how can we find alternatives that are actually better, or simple things like some of the simple ways to filter stormwater that take out some of those forever chemicals that we don't want to see providing toxic conditions for coho, for example. So that work is super cool to me because it shows, I think, the teams and the people who are being innovative and responsive to like new kind of cutting edge stuff that we're learning and really trying to make it relevant to decisions and actions that we can take to do something about it. I could really go on for forever. I feel like the risk when you guys ask for examples is like, one of my wonderful colleagues out there is gonna be, why didn't you mention that thing? We just talked about it the other day. Because there's really so much going on.
Yeah, I'm in the construction world, and as you mentioned, like the change in things, I've seen over the last while that there's been a push not only in what we're allowed to do, like with the water we put on the road,
Yeah.
but like there's a project down here that they're using Filterra, like catch basin deals that the stormwater runs into, filters, and then there's like a tree planted in it on the side of the road. Is like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of that kind of stuff start moving that way and evolve, like the development to kind of help with nature as well.
Totally. One of the other cool things that if you haven't taken a look at it, just the notion of, like, they call it biophilic design, but it's basically exactly what you were talking about, Andy. And like a lot of the things that we find are good for, removing pollutants or preventing big pulses of like flood water, from running through communities, actually end up being things that people really enjoy too, like streets with more greenery and they're just more inviting and they bring the temperature down. And, I'm not, some of those things and changing to some of those technologies certainly take money too, which is why I'm glad, and I always look for where there can be public support for that kind of shift. But it is pretty nice that those have people benefits too. And so I'm hopeful that like over time, more people will see that and it'll start to be more of like the norm that people expect in the places that they live and work. I think that will really change things when it starts to be people's expectations about what they want the places they live to look like.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say this: if you ever need to study starlings or Scotch thistle, I've got plenty of both over here. So.
I hear that. My husband and I just built a house recently, and our county is great. They have like really restrictive rules and they're really careful about development. So we've been trying to improve the buffer to the wetland that we live near. And I've been out there picking invasive species and trying to manage blackberries. And, it takes work to manage some of that stuff.
Yeah.
We can trade starling tips later.
Yeah. Yeah, but the Scotch thistle is like it's just a uphill battle. Like we got 25 acres and it's a backpack sprayer is the only way I can kind of get through a lot of it to get to it. And yeah, it's no fun.
It is no fun. I recently learned that through like Home Depot or Lowe's, you can buy really high concentration vinegar, and way different. Like I guess normally what you buy in the grocery store is maybe more like 5% vinegar, and when you can get like 30%, 50% concentrations. We've had some good luck with thistle, and it doesn't quite get the blackberry, but we've had some good luck with thistle on that one, just in case you haven't tried that one out.
Yeah, I have to try that. I'll try. I put Dawn dish soap sometimes and it helps kind of stick to it. But we've looked up like possible uses of the Scotch thistle or something like that, whatever we could use it for, because I got plenty of it.
Can you eat it? I haven't looked into that. Did you find any good uses?
There's like some medicinal, like I don't know how much of it's real, but there's like theories on it doing medicinal things with like the leaves and teas and stuff like that. But I'll let Joe Rogan try that first.
It's really neat to hear about how much the department's doing other than what people probably think about when they think about WDFW. Like I was excited to hear you talk about forever chemicals because I'm hearing so much more about that with like freshwater fish, for example, and just, and how that affects people and when we're fishing and eating that. And, the bioaccumulation in our oceans and everything like that. It's a real issue, and it's neat to see that how much you guys are doing and looking at the things that people don't normally think about when they think about you guys. It's
Totally.
You guys are an all-encompassing organization doing
It's very
so
true.
much. It's neat.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I would be remiss if I didn't add is like with all those folks, moving in and living and playing and working on the landscape, it also highlights how important our enforcement program is. I mean, we are a law enforcement agency too, and talk about the front lines of talking with people and trying to educate them about how to do the right thing. That's huge too. So truly, I mean, we've got conservation work happening, throughout the agency, which is pretty cool. I feel like that's part of the work, right? Is like highlighting some of those things, like you said, Kelsey, that people might not know about, and I think might get excited about if they did know about them.
I think a lot of people would be happy and like from all ranges of people. Like we were talking about things that bring people together, and that is could definitely be one of those things. So many of these things that you've discussed. I want to, this is a hunting podcast, so I want to tie it back to some more of the hunting side before, just to tie a bow on things. You've been amazing. I've loved hearing about getting all of this insight from what you do within the department and just all of these different projects. So how can hunting and fishing benefit management and conservation efforts? How do you feel that it does?
Oh, it's very clear that it does. I mean, sometimes it's really direct, right? Like sometimes we have concerns about populations of different animals getting too big, like exceeding the carrying capacity in a way that's going to convey disease in that population. And harvest or like culling is actually very much a management strategy to manage a threat like disease. But it's also really important because the data, the programs, the funding, the engagement in nature and conservation that comes directly from providing sustainable harvest really is one of the big foundations of conservation work. I mean, there's a lot of, as I said, like there's a lot of data, funding, people being involved in the work that just wouldn't exist if we weren't also seeking to provide sustainable harvest. And so we have to keep that kind of partnership going, and make sure that we're finding ways to really highlight that and give that credit or acknowledge, that is an existing contribution. That's not like a how can we partner, that's an existing contribution to conservation. And I think, Kelsey, when you and I talked previously, I might have said something like, one of the things I get concerned about is the number of folks we can see from that America's Wildlife Values study that I mentioned previously, who they actually fall into the disengaged from nature place, whether it's because they're fearful of fish and wildlife or they just don't know and they're ambivalent. And especially as we have a growing state, like the fact that sportsmen and women are already connected to nature. I want to try to find a way to bring all the folks who are already connected with nature and like motivated around the protection and restoration to be working together to some of those other threats to the future of fish and wildlife here that I'm really concerned about. So I would say, I hope maybe we can build on these conversations and maybe folks listening to this might be, additionally interested, like, well, how can I get involved if I'm not already? Maybe more folks will follow Andy's lead and get involved in, the Master Hunter program, because you got volunteer hours, man. You could like get involved in some of these projects.
Yep. Yeah. I just drove some owls halfway across the state the other day.
Did you really? What
Yeah.
kind? Do you know what kind of owls they were?
There was 4 barred owls and 1 screech owl, I think is what it was.
Excellent. Were
they were abandoned or something in a, well, originally it was just the 4, and then like right at the last minute the last one showed up, and they were taking them to, and I'm gonna butcher this, it's like blue something, it's a Blue Haven or some
It's like a wildlife rehabilitation.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. You're like Harry Potter.
Cute, but they also look like little aliens from the pictures you sent.
Yeah, they were not happy about being in an Amazon box.
Yeah, so I mean, I think like that is perfect, right? It's like the level of investment in the future of fish and wildlife. It's a great example. So I think that's like the challenge, right? Growing population, how do we combat the disengagement from nature and from fish and wildlife and find more of those like meaningful ways for people to get involved, and kind of breaking it down to like what's something you can do as an individual to really help with some of the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah, we try to beat home the reporting stuff, the citizen science stuff, and make sure that we get a lot of backlash from a lot of people when we try to push that, but I don't understand why. But and get more people engaged in that kind of activity and help with those stats. That's kind of something we always try to push forward.
Yeah, it's a lot of eyes and ears in the woods, right? And then finding ways of, it's like citizen science, right? Like finding ways of harnessing those observations so that we have more meaningful data to help us track trends over time. That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, hunters contribute so much to that data. So yeah, like Andy said, anytime that people aren't sending in their info, it's like, no, you guys got to do it. If you want to say you're a conservationist, you have to be doing the work. And it's not too hard. You just submit your data, and it seems to make a huge difference in the work you guys do. And accurately deciding how to move forward and, just making conservation decisions overall.
Absolutely.
We talked about this a little bit. Do you have any specific ways that hunters can, be good advocates, get involved, and to collaborate with you guys on these issues that we can help the department in the kind of the area that you work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things, I will preface this by saying, again, it's like such a big agency and we have so much work going on. I think part of our challenge is trying to find more ways of like one-stop shopping on the website or whatever, like making it easier for people to know what some of the opportunities to get involved are. But I would say there's some things that I think are pretty easy, and we've done such a good job of really coming at it from that angle of like, how can people help? I mentioned it earlier, but our Habitat at Home program, which is really trying to break it down, like what's some individual things that you can do in the space you live that's like a real contribution on the landscape. I think the other thing that's maybe a little bit, it's a little more boring, or I think sometimes this is harder for folks because not everybody has the patience or like the mental energy outside of all whatever your professional life is to comment on things or get involved in plans. But when we do something like the State Wildlife Action Plan and we have public comment, I would say it's as valuable for us. Like, is it, first of all, you have important observations. And I know it, like Kelsey, from some of our past conversations, like you are making observations about what's happening in the communities that you live in and what you see the responses from the wildlife that you observe being. And so to the degree that you can offer those perspectives or help us take a little bit of time just to tell us what you see, and if you're willing, to have us follow up if we have questions, indicate that through one of the ways that we're like gathering public input. But the other thing that I would say is watch, if you can, what kind of rules your community is putting out there about development. Even if you pick a focus, something like corridors and connectivity that we know has a huge effect on wildlife, and you can watch the kind of decisions that your community is making and try to think about it through the angle, or even just express your value, like, hey, please consider wildlife connectivity and connections in your plan, try to preserve those and enhance those. In my experience, working for government now for a really long time, it's more rare to hear from people saying what they want to see or what they support in something, a plan or decision that's happening. And so it's really valuable for us to hear those perspectives. I think if you're really up for more direct involvement, things like what Andy's doing, like we have a really pretty great volunteer program, and we're trying to make it even better and even easier for folks to say like, hey, sure, I've got like, I don't know, 3 hours a month. Like I could sign up online and see what kind of stuff is happening nearby me that I might be able to contribute to. So there's some of the easy ways. I think the other thing is, if you're really like a black belt, like I know Kelsey is, I know Ryan Garrett is, and you can track what's happening like at the state legislature, watch for, there's a lot of folks out there that are trying to highlight bills or ideas in the legislature that might have an effect on fish and wildlife. And if you can just stay engaged and try to learn and ask questions, that is like the ultimate, I think, of being involved in the civics part of helping fish and wildlife. Those are some of the things that readily come to mind, but I know you both are really engaged. Are there ways you were thinking about of being involved or being engaged that I didn't mention that you were hoping to talk about?
No, I mean, I think that's great. I think getting involved in these smaller projects, volunteering, participating in habitat projects that, help restore riparian areas or whatever, or taking care of invasive species or making your the area around you more suitable habitat. No, I think that's great. I was really excited to see that backyard habitat program as well. I've seen some people have some signs in their yard too, so it's neat to see. I'm a plant person as well. I'm kind of a freak about that and my foraging, and it's nice to see people putting all of these um, native plants in their yards. I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you kind of said it, and I just wanted to emphasize that. Like, I think if you it's sort of cheesy because I remember I heard about this in elementary school, but that whole idea of like think globally, act locally. But I think what you were speaking about is like find what you're passionate about that's close to you in your place. And if you kind of lean into that, my experience is like it will grow from there and you'll find the other people who are interested in that. And it has a way of like building momentum in a community. And I think most of the like most lasting changes that I've seen happened on the landscape that are good for fish and wildlife, they almost always have that like a core of people who like live there and they care about it and they're advocating for that thing to happen or that thing not to happen. So like don't get overwhelmed either, right? Like I know I was talking about a lot of big picture stuff at the statewide scale or landscape connectivity, but I think if like we can, as sportsmen and women and people engaged in conservation, really become a network of people watching out for that kind of stuff in our own areas, I think it does add up, right? It like ends up being a network of people contributing to conservation. So don't get overwhelmed if you can't like go to I don't know, public hearing of your county or whatever on the rules that they're adopting. Like what you do close to home, I think really makes a difference too.
Yeah, and I've noticed there's kind of a like spot for everyone too. Like you were saying, like if you don't have the brain capacity like I don't to go talk in front of the legislative people, you can always drive some owls across the state, right?
Totally. That's so true. Yeah, it's like finding your conservation fit.
Yeah. Yep. I don't know, Kelsey, did you have anything else you wanted to hit on or?
No, I mean, I think you've been a great guest. We've appreciated having you on so much. It's been a great conversation, and I like that we can bring hunters into this other side of things. I think it's important.
Or like emphasize how hunters are already part of it and hopefully like grow it. Yeah. No, I really appreciate you guys inviting me on. It's such a pleasure. And thanks for like welcoming me into the conversation and getting on the bandwagon of the stuff we want to be doing together. It's so powerful.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. We try to do our best to spread the right information and battle misinformation, especially on the social webs. I'm sure you guys have heard quite a bit lately.
Yeah, well, people are passionate. I'd always try to remember when people are worried, it's because they're passionate about it, right? And they care about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, realistically, no matter what side of the aisle, if there is one you're on, we all do want the same thing at the end.
Really.
So, but yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and I'm definitely going to hit you up with some starling tips, and
okay, good.
We'll find a little bit more about that landowner hunt program too.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to connect you guys, so let's do that.
Thank you for being such a great example of like the wonderful individuals that exist within the department. It's important to highlight that. You guys get a bad rap sometimes, but you're full of them. There's a lot of amazing people that work there. So thank you.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. And I my job is easy because there's so many amazing people here doing the work and like dedicating their lives to it. So thanks for creating a spot for it. Yeah, let's talk again sometime.
All righty. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Margen.
anywhere you wanna go. Put your money where your mouth